Um, all right, so we're going to dive in. We have an all-star panel here to talk about state democracy policy and to explain what state democracy policy is. As we were prepping in the final 10 minutes before this started, we also realized that most of us are based in Chicago or around Chicago, so we have an all-star Chicago-based team. Point of pride there. So a bit of background on Democracy Notes. Um, I'm Gabe Lerner. I am the publisher and founder of Democracy Notes. You can think of Democracy Notes as a trade publication for folks who are funders, who are practitioners, who are researchers, who are job seekers, who are looking to work in or working in the democracy space. So folks thinking about working on US democracy. And part of our mission is to bring you all great content about key questions around US democracy policy. And so the premise of this event is there might not be a ton that gets done at the federal level on, quote, democracy policy in the next few years, although some of the panelists may differ on that. But we wanted to highlight some of the awesome work being done at the state level where there are opportunities for action in both red and blue states on democracy policy. So we have a wonderful group of panelists here to talk about their state work. We've got Kristen Bennett from Service Year Alliance to talk about national service, think AmeriCorps. We've got Kevin O'Reilly from the Center for Tech and Civic Life. They work on election administration. We've Shawn Healy from iCivics. They work on civics education. And Liana Keesing from Issue One, working on tech policy. Last but not least, John Chrastka from EveryLibrary, who works on library policy. And I know we had a few questions about what exactly is library policy? What does tech policy have to do with democracy policy? All your questions and more will be answered. Couple quick housekeeping notes here. The event is an hour and 15 minutes. So when we hit the hour mark, don't freak out that we have not wrapped up. We wanted those extra 15 minutes so that we can give this event a little bit of space and time to breathe and get to more of your questions. In terms of questions, please use the Q&A function just so that we don't miss your questions so that it doesn't get lost in the chat. So please use the Q&A function rather than the chat to submit questions for the Q&A. In terms of flow for the event today, going to bring on Kevin O'Reilly from CTCL to lay the groundwork talking about the federal level. And then we'll go into a round robin, keeping the pace up, hearing from each of our panelists on their area of focus and what's going on at the state level. We'll then have a panel discussion, and then we'll go to Q&A, then we'll wrap. So let's kick this thing off with Kevin.
Awesome. Thanks, Gabe.
Great. Yeah, great to have you here. I guess first thing I'd love to know, just how did the administration of the 2024 election go?
So overall, the 2024 election was a success when it came to election administration, right? This was going into it probably, maybe the most scrutinized election in history, definitely in my lifetime. But nonetheless, the presidential election results were able to be reported on election night. Now, it's important to note, right, this doesn't just happen magically. This is thanks to the state and local election administrators who have spent the past 4 years doing tabletop exercises and trainings, coming up with plans, right? They basically had to become, masters of everything from cybersecurity to physical security to anti-terrorism to election policy, right? And so many of these responsibilities are now falling on their shoulders. So really an incredible testament to their work, to their preparation, to their execution. I think it's also important to note that there were some serious and kind of tragic things that happened along the way, whether it was the attacks on the ballot drop box in Vancouver, Washington, right, where election officials worked to, as quickly as possible, figure out who the voters were who were affected, contact them, make sure they had chance to cast a provisional ballot. And of course, the destruction that was done by Hurricanes Helene and Milton. Again, you saw folks in North Carolina and Florida rushing to set up temporary polling locations, taking all sorts of action, bomb threats, thanks to, so many election departments across the country forging really strong relationships with federal and local law enforcement. They were able to act quickly and minimize its impact on poll availability. So there are all these things that come up, and we just published a report on the emergency spending that happened in the election. I think it was about 95 counties, public reports from these counties, there was at least $33 million that was spent that was likely unallocated. And so funding's a huge issue. And that's only from 1% of all the jurisdictions across the country. So in the face of all this, election administrators pulled it off and pulled it off with style. But there's a lot that we can do to make sure that they don't have to use, paper clips and bubble gum in the future.
We love that. We don't want paper clips and bubblegum holding together our election system. That's not great. Um, but yeah, that's really helpful grounding in what actually happened in 2024 in terms of election administration. What about the state of play around election administration policy at the federal level? What's the vibe right now?
Yeah, so there, right, are a lot of creative ideas and to address concerns around election integrity. I think election integrity is an incredibly hot issue right now. And we've seen broad sweeping policies from introduced by both parties over the last few years, whether it's HR 1, the Save and Ace Act, right? And there's this whole debate about new requirements that often doesn't include or take into account the practical constraints of local election officials and what it takes to actually administer those. So, I think we'll see a lot of conversation about that. But as far as the lay of the land goes, right, Republicans have full control of Congress, but those margins, both in the Senate and the House, are very tight. And what that means is that they will need full party discipline to move anything, to move big bills. And that's just hard to get. And so we are predicting that, the biggest, most wide sweeping bills will have a very difficult time moving their way through Congress. So we expect, to see bipartisan bills as the ones that are most likely to pass. And I think there's a continuation of the trend of bipartisan appropriation bills. Now, of course, I know bipartisanship in this current political environment sounds crazy, but sounds like a tall
A
order.
bit, yeah.
But I will tell you that we are absolutely seeing indications that there is appetite for that, especially in the Senate. We're also seeing it, with reconciliation bills and House admin. So we really believe that there's an opportunity to move, in particular election funding legislation. So, I will say that our research shows that rural communities in particular don't have the reserves and revenue that they need to fund their everyday activities in many states. And so, implementing new requirements is a whole nother story. So I'll be watching to see if there's agreement to provide resources to help those election professionals implement any of these changes.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a bit of an unfunded mandate issue where folks want more requirements on election administrators, but maybe haven't yet allocated the funding for that. And then also just with really, really tight margins, big bills might need some Democratic votes in this Congress. Um, one last question. Do you feel like there are right of center champions for, more funding for election administrators?
Absolutely. And we've actually seen a lot of important voices come forward in both the House and the Senate talking about election integrity, right? There's everything from the bottom to the top. We've seen folks recognize that if we want to maintain safety, security, integrity, accessibility in our elections, we need to be able to, we need to provide funding. We need to provide resources to the people who are executing on the ground. So, that's been a big part of our work over the past few years. And we're continuing that push, and we're hopeful and really believe that there's a huge appetite from folks on both sides of the aisle to ensure that elections are secure and to fund them accordingly.
Awesome. Awesome, awesome. Okay, that is super helpful context and table setting. Talking a bit about the federal level before we dive into the state level now. So we're gonna go, Kevin, you'll be back up in a sec. We're gonna do lightning round robin through our panelists, starting with Shawn Healy from iCivics. And The prompt for this section is basically like, what does your policy area have to do with democracy? Why
Yes,
would it fall into this bucket of democracy policy? And then what's actually happening at the state level?
sure. So great to be here, Gabe, and thanks for all of you for joining. So civics on a very basic level is educating young people for informed, effective, and hopefully lifelong participation in our democracy. And we know from research, and I know we'll speak to this a little bit later, that the quantity and quality of civic education matters in terms of driving those outcomes. And for most kids in America, civics is a one semester course in American government in high school. There's a handful of states, looking at you, Alaska, Wyoming, and Maine, where they don't even have that. But what we're seeing since 2021, 24 states have adopted 38 policies that we deemed have strengthened civic education in those respective states. And we'll come to this later, but it's a good mix of red and blue states. Indiana, for one, is a state that has required civics in middle school now. They've established a state commission. Last year, they just put civic seals on student diplomas to recognize their excellence in the coursework. And then I'll close with this, just saying this spring, we track legislation on a weekly basis. We're tracking 87 bills impacting civic education in 31 states, and 61 of those bills align with our state policy menu. There's one in Wisconsin today that's in committee that would require a semester of civics in high school in Wisconsin. So the arrow is definitely pointing up as we look at civics at the state level.
That's amazing as someone who did not have required civics growing up and, ended up doing AP Gov, which was great, but learned a lot from that I did not know before. Awesome. Okay, we are going to go to Liana Keesing from issue 1 on tech policy now.
There we go. Hi, y'all. Again, really nice to be here. My name is Liana. I'm a technologist by training, but I'm also a campaigns manager at Issue 1, which is a bipartisan democracy advocacy group in Washington, D.C. And it's great to start with the question that we get asked all the time, which is sort of why Democracy Forum Group, why do you work on tech policy? Why is tech policy democracy policy? And I think, some tech policy explicitly overlaps with policy for conducting and administering elections, questions like, can generative AI be used to contact voters? But I think more broadly, issue 1 in our work focuses on the information ecosystem that sustains democracy, continuing that talk of, civics education. And that information ecosystem is increasingly funneled through big tech companies and the digital platforms over which they exert control. And I think over the past few months, everyone has probably seen for themselves, just in watching the news, how much political power has been amassed by those who can exert control over our attention. So I would make the argument that pro-democracy technology policy is really about loosening some of that control exerted by tech titans and ensuring that we have an information environment that contributes to democratic discourse in this country. So I'm going to talk about the state of play for 3 big tech policy issues. There's a million, but I'll pick 3. So first, generative artificial intelligence. I'll start there because I think it's the big, sexy policy topic of the moment, especially in the states. At this point, almost every state has introduced legislation that limits the use of AI-generated deepfakes. So like, I make an ad of my political opponent saying something they didn't say. Almost half of states have actually passed legislation in that vein. And there have been a number of legal challenges to those bills, I think notably in California, which had a really, really strict prohibition. I think it's clear that there's interest across the board in blue and red states on sort of that, basic first step principle. I think, there are only a few models for what I'd consider to be more comprehensive regulation. And I think this really matters because the challenge that we're up against with AI is ensuring that we don't fall into the same trap that we have with social media companies, where these powers kind of amass, where these companies amass power by avoiding accountability for their responsibility in degrading our information ecosystem. So I'm optimistic this year. I think we'll start to see some new bill models in states like Minnesota, New York have already started playing around with them when it comes to things like liability and transparency for AI platforms. The second topic I'll dive into, sorry, I'm running through a lot of things, but data
That's great.
which I think is the key to understanding how these companies have amassed so much power over our attention and over our political discourse. So targeted political ads and in disinformation, I'm a privacy person by nature, but like to make the point, targeted political ads, disinformation are so uniquely effective online because of the deeply personal data that these companies collect about you. And I think importantly, there's no federal comprehensive data privacy standard, which means that states are really the key battlegrounds for this fight. So Maryland and California are two states that have already taken the lead here, have really strong bills. Maryland just last year. But this year, we're tracking legislation in Vermont, New York, Connecticut, Virginia. All of them have interesting legislation to strengthen sort of their existing laws on the books. And I think that's a really key fight and one that a lot of groups are working on. But I think we're really excited to be at that table. And then the last thing I'll mention and close out with is I think there's this really interesting intersection that's happening right now in the States when it comes to kid safety, democracy, and technology. I think Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, for those of you who saw it, I think really captured the minds of a lot of parents who are watching their kids, who are scared about what they'll encounter online, and who feel as though these tech companies, these big tech companies, have completely escaped accountability, both for harms to their kids, but I think also for harms to our democracy as well. So I think that's really powerful momentum, and it's something we're watching closely in Nebraska, Tennessee, New York. Tennessee and New York, I think, some of it is the phone-free school movement, some of it is kids code and online safety rules, but I think that's something that we're thinking as well about how we can harness that more broadly to create sort of these broader tech accountability moments on behalf of democracy. I'll finish there, but excited to take y'all's questions.
I love it. That's awesome. That's awesome. So much to dive into in the panel. That's great. All right, Kevin, you are back up.
Awesome.
What's going on? What's going on at the state level with election administration?
Absolutely. So I think, right, we're seeing, again, like I said, election integrity is a hot topic, and we are seeing a lot of legislative policies rolling around the country. So some are trending towards expanding absentee voting. Some are working to restrict those voting hours. There's a lot of conversation about proof of citizenship, all these kind of things, right? And so what I'll say is from my position at CTCL, where we don't take positions on those kind of issues, what you're going to hear me say over and over and over again is funding, funding, funding. So none of those requirements, however they turn out, can be implemented without additional funding. You said, the magic, terrible words of unfunded mandates earlier, Gabe. We cannot continue to see those. So that's one thing that we're going to be watching, is to make sure if there are mandates, making sure that there's funding going along with it.
I love that. That's super helpful. All right, next up, Kristen Bennett, CEO of Service Year Alliance. Kristen, national service, AmeriCorps type stuff is definitely one of the head scratchers. Like, it's not obvious on the face of it what that has to do with democracy policy. Tell us more.
Yeah, happy to. So, Service Year Alliance, we're a national nonprofit that's working to make a year of service a common expectation and opportunity. And you'll hear national service tossed around. We have a long history in our country of service, back from like the Civilian Conservation Corps in the 30s to Peace Corps and Vista in the 60s. In more recent years, with AmeriCorps really leading the way for service domestically, we're seeing about 60,000 people a year on average serving. And what people, might not realize is that service is something so valuable because it actually does have a triple bottom line, that it has the impact in the community, but it also has this transformative experience on the individuals who serve, as well as has a way to really fuel civic renewal in communities. When we look at national service alums, 94% of alums self-report that they vote. They're more likely to be civically engaged. They're more likely to engage with someone that, thinks and believes different things and work across lines of difference. So if that isn't democracy, I don't really know what is, right? The ways in which people come to their communities and contribute, both as far as impact, but also as far as the way they live their lives as citizens and neighbors. It's a huge lever we have to work within our country to, try and invest and strengthen our democracy. Something else I'll say is that, we talk a lot about this as national service, and it's national because it is and should be nationwide. It's not because it's solely this decision, this body where decisions are made in DC. By structure, 75% of AmeriCorps resources actually go through state level, state service commissions and decisions. So from the beginning, when this was created 30 years ago, there was an intention that governors and local decision makers would have a say in the priorities for how we mobilize individuals in service to address the needs in our communities. And so historically, it has been very active at the state level. I came into national service by starting my career at a state service commission. We've also seen a ton of progress over the last 4 years, with more and more innovation and expansion coming out of calls from governors, as well as investments from state legislatures, to creating state conservation corps, to pandemic response, both within the pandemic as well as learning loss that resulted in it, to environmental resilience and disaster preparedness and response. There's a lot moving, and our goal is to figure out how we can continue to support states on those expansions and innovations in the coming weeks, months, years.
I love it. Also, great flag that it is national service, but it actually happens in local communities, and most of it goes through the state level. That is helpful to have in the back of the mind. All right, last but not least, John from EveryLibrary. Welcome.
Hey, Gabe, how are you?
Good, good. All right, so what is library policy?
Well, library policy, when it comes to democracy, library policy is a 10th Amendment creature. You know, the First Amendment matters a lot in libraries. Censorship is a big problem right now around the country, unconstitutional censorship, and also that reach into K-12 as well as into the civic space. But really, public libraries are 10th Amendment creatures. Most of what's done is not federal, it's at the states. How are we organized? Everything from board service, you know, boards of trustees, boards of directors for libraries, the election of those individuals, the chance to stand up as a civic participant. That 10th Amendment conversation is how do we tax ourselves? And that conversation about how do we choose to put our tax money to work is a big fight. It makes Americans crazy. That 10th Amendment conversation is also part of the election administration. A lot of state libraries are cheek by jowl with the Secretary of State's offices. So at the systems level, at the state level, there's real conduits, I think, for election administrators to have big conversations about how do we want to inform the public? How do we want to activate the public? But at the local level, 10th Amendment, you know, being what it is, from a theory of change perspective, libraries are last mile conversations with people that should become enfranchised to vote, that should become aware of how to cast a ballot, who should be in a conversation about, well, I mean, one person's mis and disinformation is another person's deeply held belief, but in conversations about literacy. You know, how do we interrogate information? How do we use information? You know, they talk about the states as a laboratory of democracy, and that's true when it comes to policy issues. But at the most local level, where do people get together and hang out? Where do people talk? And one of those venues, besides, of course, Gabe, the local tavern, which we all enjoy, the other venue is the local library. You know, how do we engage in these conversations as folks who want to be part of and who might be newly awakened to the power of being part of that ability to cast one's ballot in an informed society.
I love it. That is a perfect segue. Thank you, John, into our panel discussion.
That's why we're here today.
Love it. All right, welcome back, everyone, all at once. Let's talk about Republicans. So I assume that when you are going out and talking in state legislatures about these various policy areas, you are not framing it as democracy policy, which is left-coded right now. But I won't make you do a role play with me as Republican elected official, but like how do you talk about these policy areas to right of center folks, if you do?
I could start us out. So I would say we talk about them in a very similar way. And we start from the standpoint, when you're talking to a policymaker, somebody that is in the democracy space, I could ask our fellow panelists here, I bet you had a good civics teacher along the way, right? I bet you had a formative civics experience, whether it was in a classroom setting or during your formative years of high school and college. There was something that motivated policymakers to pursue a life of public service, right? Or to pursue public service. So we start from that standpoint. Almost every time I have a meeting with a policymaker, they make that point. Like, I'm here because of this civics teacher, or I played your games growing up. I played your iCivics games, right? And there is strong bipartisan support for building stronger foundational civic knowledge. So there's broad agreement on that. There is significant, I gave you the numbers before, just the activity across the board. Some of our biggest wins, I give you Indiana as an example. That's a state where Republicans control about 80% of both chambers of the legislature. That middle school bill we got passed in 2021, one no vote in the two chambers, right? So it was tremendously bipartisan. We had a big win 2 years ago in New Hampshire. That's a very tip of the knife Republican majority, but a Republican governor signed that bill into law. There's now a middle school class in New Hampshire. There's required instructional time for civics in New Hampshire. And then I think as we pivot, we haven't mentioned this yet, but we're less than a year and a half now out from our 250th birthday. And there was real action when I was a young person. I was very young when we celebrated the bicentennial. I don't know if I was walking yet, but I was a little bit older when we celebrated the bicentennial of the Constitution, and I benefited from the work of that bicentennial commission. There was a fellowship created called the James Madison Fellowship, and it afforded an opportunity for someone like me, a first-generation college student, to go to graduate school to study the Constitution. And there's more than 1,700 educators like myself across the country that have benefited from the program over the last 3 decades. That came out of the celebration of the bicentennial. So I think there's a real opportunity here at the national level, but yes, state by state, I believe every state has some type of A250 commission in place right now to make an investment in understanding our founding documents, the institutions undergirding them, to build an attachment to them, and to live up to those lofty ideals that we're kind of forever chasing, right? And that's an opportunity to work across the aisle, to work with the Republicans. We didn't mention the context, but the Republicans control 57 state chambers. That's the vast majority, right? They have a high percentage of the seats. I should have checked in advance, but I think it's high 50s in terms of percentage of seats. So of course we work with the Republicans and need to be versant in how to do so. And I will say some of our best champions for civics are Republicans. I'm really proud to say that. That bill in Wisconsin I mentioned before, that's sponsored by Assembly Republicans, including the Speaker of the House.
That's amazing. Okay, others, what's your set of talking points around working with Republican electeds?
I can jump in here. I think that regardless of, your party registration status, all Americans can agree that secure, reliable elections are fundamental to our democracy, right? And so while there may be partisan fissures around how elections should be run, where authority should be concentrated, things like that, if we are laser focused on election security funding and that idea of election security, which we see a lot of, concern and support for across both parties, this is less of a political problem and more of a prioritization problem, right? So to give you a sense, right, something like 80% of election administrators and the majority of county officials are affiliated with the Republican Party. I am currently actually in Central Mississippi at the state election commissioners annual meeting. And I will tell you that there is energy and enthusiasm and excitement about making sure that we kind of fix the funding gap that election administrators face. I'd even go so far to say that 99% of county officials, if we take out the high tax base communities like Loudoun County, would say that they could use more resources to make sure their election offices are prepared. And so, we have seen a lot of success working with Republicans, Democrats, independents at all levels of government, right? Talking about the states, States like Kentucky and South Carolina, as well as Michigan and Minnesota, have prioritized passing state funding for local election administration in the last 2 years. Even just last week at the federal level, I heard top staffers from the key committees in both the Senate and the House on both sides of the aisle talk about the need for election funding, particularly when it comes to election security. So, really it's about continuing to work and make sure that this is at the top of their priority list, the top of the to-do list for federal lawmakers, for state lawmakers, because ultimately, right, election administration needs an additional $40 million per year is what we've kind of calculated out to make sure that it's running safe, secure, accessibly. And so that's going to take all levels of government and funding in order to make that happen.
I'll jump in on tech for a second, because I think we're kind of in an interesting moment with this. And I'll actually start by saying Issue One was founded as a money and politics organization. And the intersection right now between money and politics and sort of tech policy and tech democracy policy, I think, is this idea of tech accountability. And federally, we are in a little bit of an interesting moment. I think everyone saw that picture from the inauguration of sort of the tech titans standing right there, in front of the presidents at the inauguration. But I don't know that that's as much the case in the states. And even federally, I think there's a lot of opportunities, and everyone tends to generally agree across the board that there are clear and demonstrable harms when it comes to our online information ecosystem. Now, I personally might point to harms being more like disinformation and foreign malign influence operations and things like that. But part of the reason I mentioned sort of the parents movement earlier is I think, you're a state legislator, regardless of party, you have kids, like you're thinking about what your kids are seeing online, and that's of concern to you. And broadly, I think there's this sense held across the board that tech companies have really been not held accountable at all for their role and their harms in particular. So I'm thinking, I talk less about the information ecosystem, not even when I'm talking Democrats, Republicans. I think that's a wonderful talking point. I think it's a very intellectual talking point to say, what does it look like to have a clean and democracy, affirming information ecosystem? I think the harms are what people see and what people feel. And the harms are so clear and so evident when it comes to kids. When it comes to national security, I talk about that, all the time, especially on the Hill at the federal level. But I think people tend to understand, regardless of party, that these tech companies have been able to operate completely unaccountably. And, if you're a border security person, then I'm talking to you about fentanyl and the online sale of fentanyl that happens online. But the solution and the solution set are the same ones that it would take to clean up our information ecosystem. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And that's part of the reason, the big federal tech legislation that we've seen has been deeply bipartisan. And the same is true in states. But the Kids Online Safety Act, that was a Marsha Blackburn bill out of Tennessee. And that was something that she was championing. You saw a 91-3 vote in the Senate on that bill last year. Like, think of any other bill that has a 91-3 vote in the Senate. So I think that really speaks to the fact that generally tech accountability is a bipartisan idea, and what that looks like in practice, and bringing that, to think about what it means to do that for democracy, I think is the challenge right, in front of us right now.
I'll share that we have the, I'll say, benefit of being able to speak from a service perspective about the community impact, right? And lead with the fact that service in AmeriCorps is about getting things done. So there is always somewhere to start with a policymaker or someone in the community. And since it's so localized, you tend to see less controversy, right? It's about the kid in the school. It is about how safe the neighborhood is. It is about whether that grandparent can stay in their home. And the added, gain or value is the fact that you get to also use the power of people and their contributions and put them into the experience where, again, it doesn't really matter if I agree with the person next to me. We're there so that that kid can be safe, or the family is fed. And being able to bring people together in common cause is something that has been a bipartisan idea historically, and historically national service has been supported from presidents and individuals from both sides of the aisle. So being able to actually show that you can come together around something you care about and have this added benefit is, I think in a lot of ways, it's a fairly American idea of like put a person into to work, into action, or to go out and have the experience and get something done as a way to show that there's value in bringing not just an employee, right, or not just a volunteer, but someone in service to address needs in a community.
I love that. Um, okay, kind of a weird question here, but can you pull back the curtain on what it's actually like to advocate for policy at the state level? Like, I have not done that personally. I assume most people have not done that. What do you actually do?
Well, let me. I'm in the middle of writing bills this week. I had to put
There we go.
down a red line on something that was pretty messy, and then I had to pick up a black pen and start writing some stuff from scratch. Right now, the conversations are fraught. Whether you're in a state that is positive to your issues or negative to your issues. And it really doesn't matter right now. The sides are so polarized right now, Gabe, that champions want to be very performatively championing their issues, at least that I've been finding on right to read, freedom of speech, structure of government, things as prosaic as whether or not we should have books available for communities. The champions want to be champions. And whether it's a messaging bill, or something that's viable in that particular chamber or legislature. And the opposition is just as performative. And it is unattached in certain respects from implementation of law. Every bill is a messaging bill right now, at least that we're sitting on. I've got bills that are criminalization of librarianship and education and museum professionals, where they want to change the state. We have 75 years of established law around obscenity law and prosecution in order to weaponize that. I've got places where we're looking to write new civil rights law about the right to read. It's very interesting, might be a little novel, but on both sides of the aisle right now, on both sides of the issue, we're finding it to be very hard to find an implementation-focused conversation. Maybe that's just us because it's censorshipville, but when the culture wars hit the committee of jurisdiction, all bets are off.
I just say quickly, to me, a little different spin on this, and this is not as much the moment, but my the second half of my career doing this advocacy work. There's much more access and opportunities for influence at the state level. So when you're doing this work on the Hill, usually you're meeting with staff. All due respect to the staff, spend a lot more time at the state level meeting with the principals themselves. And just a couple kind of fun examples in Illinois, we were working a decade ago on a high school civics bill, and we got out of committee, but we lost. We didn't have much Republican support out of committee, and had a number of teachers reach out to the members of the committee, the Republican members of the committee, and there was one member in particular that got up when our bill was called on the floor and said, "I'm changing my vote. I'm urging you to join me on this. I was schooled by a social studies teacher." And similarly, we had a senator when we were working the roll call in the other chamber, just trying to get a sense of where he was. He's like, I'm leaning against this. It is the unfunded mandate, the dreaded unfunded mandate, but I'm staring at a stack of 35 letters on my desk that were written by students urging me to vote for this bill. And when it was called, he voted yes.
That's amazing. That's a really neat story. That's really incredible.
I guess the only thing I'd add about working at the state level, and it's something we're really conscious of, issue one, we're not a grassroots organization. And I think we're just really conscious of, when you're from an org that works primarily federally, jumping into a state and just being like, hi, we're the experts, listen to us, we're really conscious of that kind of astroturfing and presenting as though we exist in the state. So I would just say that, for our work and when we're thinking about advancing anything, we lean really heavily on the ground partners, other groups that do have grassroots presence, that have members. I think, when it comes to state policy, like me coming in and testifying as an expert means a heck of a lot less than, someone who's actually in their district, one of their constituents coming in, a small business owner coming in and saying, actually, privacy policy wouldn't hurt me, contrary to what Meta's lobbyist over there just said. Like, those things matter so much. So all I would say is we really rely heavily on partners, people on the ground, grassroots, and then what we try to do is provide strategic direction, offer support, offer resources that some of these local groups don't necessarily have.
That makes me feel a lot better about how democracy actually works in practice, that for you, effectiveness looks like having constituents care about this issue and advocate for this issue. That's amazing. So, okay, next question, another kind of weird one. This one's weird in a conceptual kind of way. Why policy? Like there's so many levers to create change. I mean, lots of organizations on this Zoom call, they do work that doesn't go through policy making. Why policy?
Well, I mean, if you're not in the authorization, you'll never be in the appropriation.
That's a weedsy phrase. Please explain.
Well, I mean, like, we're authorized under, state or federal laws to be paid to do the work as a civic institution, education, for example. If it's not, if the um, services for children experiencing homelessness, if that wasn't in the law, then you wouldn't have professional staff, you wouldn't have systems of support. So if you're not in the authorization, the appropriations won't be there. So your mission, vision, and values as an advocacy organization wouldn't be realizable.
That's really helpful.
I would say for civics, you know, we learn about politics in a variety of different venues in life, right? Our families, our peer networks, the workplace. But the true captive audience from a public policy perspective is we have compulsory education laws. And that is a key time for civic development. Schools have a historic civic mission. That's why we founded public schools in America, was to prepare young people for democracy. And then I think it's really important to say that this hasn't been mentioned, I think, so far in our conversation. When we first started advocating for civics in Illinois, the reality was most kids in Illinois actually had a civics course already. About 60% did. The question is, who are the 40% that didn't, right? And for the most part, Illinois is a big state, right? Most of the state was about 75% of the kids had access to a course. That was outside of Chicago. Chicago suburbs is about half and half. City of Chicago, 20% of our students go to Chicago public schools, didn't have a course. That district is over 80% free reduced lunch, 90% students of color. That's who didn't have a civics course in Illinois. So we have a law now that requires a semester of civics in high school. Every kid in Illinois has access to that class. And I'm proud to say Chicago Public Schools has gone above and beyond. Every kid now takes a year of civics in high school at every high school in the district. So that's why policy.
Once again, inspiring. That's really awesome to hear. Okay, as many of you would like to answer this, you're welcome to. If you are successful, what would it feel like for, the parent of a child who's on social media? What would it feel like for a librarian? What would it feel like for someone going through a National Service America program? What would it feel like for an election administrator or for a civics teacher or someone in a civics class? Like, what would that experience be if you're successful?
Oh, okay, I'll jump in. Well, for us, success is that, as a parent, you would be raising children in a community knowing that service is an option, right? So as your children are coming up through the K-12 system, and coming to the end of high school, that they have service as an option, military service as an option, college, workforce, et cetera, and that understanding that that this is widely available and accessible regardless of kind of whatever zip code you grew up in, and that it was broadly embedded in our society in a way that regardless of what you're interested in as well, you could find a way to serve and show up and help. So whether it's education or the environment, or public health or public safety, that we have found the ways to mobilize and let young Americans show up, help, learn, and figure out their pathways.
I love this question, right? Because it's easy to get caught up in the doom and gloom and the problems that exist, which are very real and need changes. But it's also important to think about what the future could look like if we're successful, right? And when it comes to election administration, I don't want to talk about the election administrators, even though we love them, they're our focus, but I want to talk about the voter, right? If we're able to fully fund our elections, you'll be able to walk into your polling place, know exactly where it is, walk in, get the help you need, cast your vote, 2, 5, 10 minutes and move on. And then every step of the way, you will know where your ballot is. You will know how it's being processed, right? The process will be transparent, so you're able to understand all that. You won't have to worry about safety issues, about, potential terrorist attacks. We won't have to, election administrators will be able to preempt any sort of, foreign propaganda or interference efforts, right? You won't hear about cybersecurity, ransomware attacks about counties. It's a democracy in a world in which we cast our ballot, and we know that the results are coming through. We're seeing the results on election night, or within a couple weeks, depending on how the different states' processes work. But really, there is an opportunity to move to a system where it's seamless, it's easy, and we know that seamless and easy experience is correlated to increasing trust in the election process all around.
Sorry, Shawn. I'll jump in here for just a sec to talk about social media, because I think that's a pretty easy one. Gabe, I'd love to go online, post on Twitter that I disagree with you, and not get called a Nazi by someone. Like, I'll just be really frank. I think almost all of us can see how toxic and difficult it is to engage in discourse online. The ability to have those conversations, I think it ties into so many of the other themes that have been covered here today. Media literacy, like civics educate, like all of that ends up being so deeply tied to our ability to disagree, to conduct, the actual practice of democracy day to day. And so I think, it really comes down to being able to have those conversations online, know that our attention isn't just going to get sucked up. I'm going to steal, Steve Bannon's phrase to get negative for just a second. Like, he describes his theory for, undermining democracy a little bit as like flooding the zone with shit. And right now, that is what going online feels like. And I think what we are hoping for, and I'm a technologist, like, I'm not like burn it all down. Social media has a lot of benefits. There are a lot of good things. The connection that it offers, the promise that it offers, I think still stands. But really what it would look like is being able to go online and see that original vision, that promise that sort of was there back in 2008, 2010, when this was pitched to us as a place and an opportunity for connection.
Yeah, two thoughts. And John, I would assume there's a parallel for you with this. One, thank a teacher. This is a perilous moment to teach, particularly to teach civics, which is a political act. Yes. And so I'd love to see a world where we recognize our civics teachers as bulwarks of our democracy, which is very much what they are. That's the first one. Two, I've been teaching for 25 years, and people ask me, like, how are kids these days? And I think there's the sense that young people are apathetic, and they sat out this last election. And yes, turnout was down, but they're not apathetic. Young people come to my classes deeply passionate about issues, but want nothing to do with our politics, I think for reasonably so, and have deep distrust of institutions. And frankly, the institutions haven't treated many of them very well. And I think it's our job as civics teachers and practitioners to teach young people how to work through those, yes, imperfect institutions to build a more perfect union. That is the project of civic education, right? To build attachment to this ongoing experiment in constitutional democracy, and to hold ourselves up to that lofty ideal. So that's my vision for young people, to have the requisite knowledge, skills, attitudes, and really beliefs that they can make a difference on the issues that are near and dear to their heart. And they do that in partnership with outstanding educators.
I'm gonna say, Shawn, thank you for that, and to thank a librarian, thank an educator, thank an election administrator. Right now, let's also thank a public health professional too. We're still in that hangover. Gabe, what looks like success is that local library boards, local school boards, county administrators, town councils, city councils, state legislatures, and God bless America, our Congress, maybe reads and follows the Constitution. The issues around this are pretty core and fundamental. If we're talking about First Amendment issues and unconstitutional censorship, and we're weaponizing the First Amendment's freedom of speech. I'm sorry, we're weaponizing the challenge policies and the right to petition and the right to assemble against the freedom of speech. We're just going to grind ourselves down. The success for libraries is the limited public forum of the First Amendment meets the civil rights enhanced by the 14th Amendment public accommodation space where we can all get together and follow the law so that there's not fear or favor. And that goes with what's in the collection in a library. It goes with who can come in the front door and who can have their identity expressed in the programs and services that are being offered. It's pretty basic. We got to get back to something that has that commonality as Shawn was describing, and that lofty goal of learning civics for the children has to be done in boardrooms, in meeting rooms, in policy frameworks by the adults first. And libraries are a good place to practice that skill set.
I gotta say, I'm loving the love fest and kudos in the chat between the panelists and also the responses from the panelists to questions in the chat. But it's been cool to see the shout outs across, libraries, service years, etc. Also, quick plug, we're going to turn to audience questions in just a minute. So if you have a question for the panel, please put that in the Q&A function. You can put it in the chat, just makes it a little easier to spot if it's in the Q&A. Before we do, feel free to say, Gabe, that's not how it works, or Gabe, this is dumb. But do you all ever work with other of the panelists or other folks choose on advocacy at the state level? Like, are your partners ever coming from other democracy policy angles? Would the Civics Now coalition in a given state be working with, the election administrators in a given state because they're both democracy policy issues?
Yeah, I'd say quickly, like a common ally has been the League of Women Voters across states. I'm doing a program tonight in Tennessee with the League of Women Voters there. And then another really great ally has been state chambers of commerce. So just a couple that come to mind quickly.
Yeah, so when it comes to censorship issues and unconstitutional censorship, it cuts across a lot of different groups. When we talk about dignity of work, public sector work, it's the unions, anybody who's involved in public facing. The coalitions are not what they were a few years ago because folks are recognizing that these are not partisan issues. They are core and fundamental to the functioning of our society issues.
I'll jump in and give sort of two examples. One sort of key piece of tech policy that we've been thinking a lot, and this has to go with some of the accusations that have been coming from the right, especially of censorship that happens online. Some of the real victims of that attack have been folks who do transparency research and who actually study things on the platforms. They have been villainized. Jim Jordan and the Judiciary Committee in particular have really attacked them, gone after them. A lot of the observatories at universities that were doing this research have closed. It's a pretty dismal time for that. And I think, we've been thinking a lot about how, we think of those folks as democracy defenders, and we'd put librarians, K through 12 teachers, there are a lot, election administrators are all in that same category. So we've been thinking a lot about how to connect all of those folks. And then I think the second thing I'll say is just, issue one, I'm from our tech reform team. We also have a completely separate election protection team. And I spend a lot of time talking to election administrators and thinking a lot about the problems of election administration, where they intersect with tech. Things like I said, those AI deepfake bills, I think it's absolutely essential that the people who are the real subject experts, who aren't necessarily the technologists, but are the people who are actually having to do that in practice, are weighing in. And I think that's been a really fruitful collaboration. We work with lots of groups like CTCL, on sort of some of these issues. And I think that's something we're really excited about continuing, because I think you're exactly right that some of the most interesting work in this space happens at the intersection when sort of democracy advocates and democracy defenders can unite and find sort of common cause across their issues.
Liana, one follow-up question for you, and this is our first one from the audience. Christine Gallagher asked an awesome question, tying back to her work in person, bridging differences across religious divides. She was basically like, haven't really seen good examples of dialogue across difference online. Does that happen? Liana, have you seen good examples of sort of healthier online spaces?
Yeah, I think I have. I mean, I think they're fewer and further between, but it is absolutely possible. I think part of what's so frustrating is tech companies have kind of sold you and said, like, this is how it has to be online. Like this, you're just used to it. I don't know if, I'm solidly Gen Z, had an Instagram back in when I turned 13. Like that was a very different Instagram than the Instagram that exists now. I saw posts from my friends. Facebook, 10 years ago was like, huh, what's, my classmate Bill up to? Who's getting married? Like who's doing that? And now it's like ads. Hey, look, here's the spot. Here's an AI generated image. Like here's what this looks like. So I think, we've kind of accepted that that's the status quo. And part of what our messages and what we're trying to push across is like, no, these are very distinct changes that tech companies have made on purpose to get more money, and no one has stopped them. And these are the richest, most powerful companies in human history, and they have just not been, again, I'll repeat over and over, like they are not being held accountable. But they are, I think oftentimes they say, well, it's just the First Amendment, we're just processing content. That's not true. They are purposefully controlling the algorithms that show you they are designing their products in unsafe and dangerous ways. And because of, I can talk all day about Section 230 and product liability at the federal level, that's a deeply tech wonky policy topic, but like they have completely escaped product liability in the same way that if anyone designed a defective product, there would at least be opportunities to have lawsuits to settle those things and all that. So all I would say is I think there are absolutely ways to change their products and change the things that they are presenting to you. And we don't at all have to accept this as the status quo.
Two questions, Kevin, for you. Both of them have to do with money, but in different ways. So one from Michael Whitehorn. If you're able to get election funding through this Congress, will it include significant caveats or strings like the elimination of mail ballots, et cetera? And I'll go to the next one after that.
So our goal is to reduce the number of strings attached, right? And I think a big reason for that is that there are something like 10,000 local election jurisdictions across the country, and everyone is different, right? So I live in Chicago, what the election jurisdiction there needs is going to be a lot different than in Alaska, where literally there's a jurisdiction where all the poll workers live in the same area, but they need to get a small plane to go and pick them up on election day and get them to the polls, or in Idaho where they need a snowmobile to be able to access voters, right? So there are so many differences. And so that's why a huge part of our focus with the push for election funding is let's minimize those strings. Let's make sure that we're just giving the money, as much of it as possible. Our goal is 2/3 of the appropriation to the jurisdictional level so that they can solve the problems because they're the ones who know it. So I think that's a big piece. And I think, that's just really is the way that it should be because the need is there. So they need to be able to get that money on a regular basis as they need it without those strings attached as much as possible.
That makes sense. Separate funding stream, private foundations. I mean, philanthropy has filled a lot of the gaps left by the absence of federal funding for election administration. Do you think funders will be ready to show up again in the next couple election cycles to fill those gaps? And this is a question from Rachel Levin.
So it's a good question. And, we've definitely seen in recent years, I think something like 20 states have passed and implemented private funding bans when it comes to election administration. So, those policies, those are the laws on the books. And we absolutely believe in, following the laws on the books. But the fact of the matter is the funding gap still exists, right? Unfortunately, election administration has been chronically underfunded. So the money's got to come from somewhere. And that's why, we have really focused so hard on making sure that, yes, states and locals, but also the federal government is doing their part, because it is these 10,000 jurisdictions who are conducting federal elections on their behalf. So it seems only reasonable that they would, pitch their part in.
That makes sense. Yeah. Kristen, question for you. This is not from someone who submitted a question, but I'm just curious. There's, there's a lot of concern about the gutting of federal agencies. Do you worry about that with AmeriCorps? And yeah, I know that's not a super, super fun question, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that it's fair for everyone to be concerned if the agency that is tied to their work is named or in question. I think the federal funding and is critical. It is. It's at the core that, I think the main driver of this whole sector. I think the thing to remember is that it is matched more than 1-to-1, right? We see state level dollars and philanthropy, private foundations also like giving just as much to match every federal dollar that goes into national service. So it's a time where we need to be doing what we can to show the impact of national service in AmeriCorps and communities across the country, to show how well like our localities and our nonprofits and our public entities really are leveraging the investments from the federal government.
I love it. That makes sense. All right. I'm going to pause us there. This has been jam-packed and wonderful. Thank you so, so, so much to our panelists. Thank you to everyone for joining this. A quick ask of the folks who are attending. We have a survey. We have a survey at the end. So I think when you leave the meeting, there will be a survey that pops up. Please fill that out. Give us your thoughts. Give us your feedback. That is super, super, super helpful. But again, just John, Shawn, Liana, Kristen, y'all are the best. Thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you so much for participating in this event.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for organizing.
I've got a lot of people to follow up with now.
Yeah,
Dun, dun, dun.
this is great. And a last thing I'll say is just those of you, especially those of you who aren't in DC and are located in states, like I think all of us would say broadly, if any of these topics interest you, please reach out, please contact us. As we mentioned, so much of this policy is actually driven by people who just live in the state and are passionate and about bringing together these coalitions. So, excited to keep working on this and hopefully doing more great work together in the future.
Always organizing. Look at that. These are pros. All right. Thank you all so much.
Take care again.